Hey guys, and welcome back. Tonight, we journey to a place where the silence of the desert meets the whispers of gods, a remote oasis that once held the ear of conquerors and kings. We're talking about the Siwa Oasis and its legendary Oracle of Amun, a sanctuary of improbable life and ancient mystery, where destinies were sought and, some say, shaped. So, before you get comfortable and we trek across those ancient sands, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into history's most enigmatic corners. And please, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see our global community gathering. Now, dim those lights, maybe get that fan humming softly in the background, and let's ease into tonight's mysterious journey together. Or, tucked deep within Egypt's western desert, beyond dunes that roll like waves and sun-bleached rocks that shimmer under a brutal sun, lies the Siwa Oasis, a place of improbable life and ancient mystery, surrounded on all sides by arid desolation. Siwa is a mirage made real. Cool, freshwater springs, groves of date palms, and olive trees where there should be none, but its true claim to fame is not its beauty or its isolation. It's the divine voice that once echoed from its sands. Here, at this remote outpost near the borderlands of Egypt and Libya, stood the Temple of the Oracle of Amun, a sacred sanctuary dedicated to one of Egypt's highest gods. Amun wasn't just a deity of the Nile. His influence extended across empires, merging with the sun god Ra to become Amun-Ra, the king of the gods. But Siwa's oracle wasn't just a religious outpost, it was a spiritual beacon, a place where men came not to worship blindly, but to ask questions of fate and receive answers. Unlike the colossal temples of Thebes or Karnak, the Temple of Amun at Siwa was modest in size, built from limestone and mud brick. Weathered by centuries of heat and wind, its strength lay in silence and secrecy. The temple was nestled within the town's sandstone cliffs, overlooking the vast sweep of the desert. It felt less like a monument and more like a whisper from the divine, hidden, intimate, powerful. The oracle at Siwa was said to speak through the high priest in trances or ritualistic ceremonies, delivering answers from Amun himself. Those allowed to approach the shrine brought questions of war, succession, and identity. Not just common folk, but pharaohs and conquerors journeyed across the blistering sands, seeking a glimpse of their destiny. What made Siwa different was not just its isolation, it was its independence. Though nominally part of Egypt, the oasis existed in its own rhythm. Its inhabitants spoke a Berber dialect. Its priests were not mere tools of the state. They guarded the oracle with fierce autonomy. The desert itself was a barrier, both literal and spiritual. To reach Siwa was a test of resolve, but to hear the oracle's voice was to receive something few ever did. Certainty from the gods, or so it was believed. The Oracle of Amun at Siwa wasn't like other oracles. It didn't dwell in the bustling cities of Egypt or the rich temples of the Nile Valley. It existed in silence, surrounded by nothing but dunes and the haunting wind. This isolation gave it mystique and power. People believed that only in such stillness could the gods be heard. The rituals of the oracle were cloaked in secrecy. The high priest, acting as the mouthpiece of Amun, would retreat into the inner sanctum, where only a select few were ever permitted. There, in a chamber heavy with incense and guarded by thick stone walls, he would enter a trance-like state, his voice said to carry the weight of divine wisdom. Questions were asked in hushed tones. Answers, once delivered, were obeyed without challenge. The answers themselves were often cryptic, cloaked in ambiguity, yet full of meaning. Like the Greek oracle at Delphi, the oracle of Siwa rarely spoke in direct terms. Its power lay in suggestion, in offering direction without dictating fate. But unlike Delphi, the Siwan oracle was also deeply intertwined with Egyptian religious cosmology. It wasn't merely a seer, it was a channel of a god who was also king. Pilgrims came from across North Africa and beyond, braving the merciless journey through the western desert to hear the oracle speak. Merchants, generals, tribal leaders, and even kings arrived with offerings, oil, incense, gold, hoping for divine insight into the most difficult choices of their lives. Some came for personal counsel. Others came with questions that could determine the fate of nations. The oasis itself aided the mystique. At night, the desert grew quiet and impossibly dark. The sky blanketed with stars. The wind through the date palms sounded almost like voices. Visitors would report dreams, visions, or sudden feelings of revelation after their visit. Whether by ritual or suggestion, the experience left a deep impression. But it wasn't just religious seekers who came. Political figures understood the oracle's value. To receive its blessing was to claim legitimacy, not just among locals, but across the Mediterranean world. A prophecy from Siwa could crown a king, justify a war, or forge an empire, and soon one man would test that very power, carrying with him a question no mortal had yet dared ask. Was he a god or merely a king? What do you think it took to make that journey? The sheer will to cross that desert for a chance? Just a chance. At an answer from the divine? Let me know your thoughts below. In 331 BCE, a young conqueror rode into the Egyptian desert with a crown on his head and a question in his heart. His name was Alexander of Macedon, known to history as Alexander the Great. By this point, he had already defeated the Persian Empire in Egypt and had been declared a pharaoh. But titles weren't enough. Alexander sought divine affirmation, not from men, but from gods, and so he turned towards Siwa. The journey was perilous. The path from Memphis to Siwa was not marked on any clear map. It wound through scorching desert, salt flats, and shifting dunes. Greek historians wrote that Alexander and his caravan nearly lost their way, saved only by miraculous signs, ravens guiding their route, or perhaps divine serpents slithering through the sand. Others claimed they were led by rainstorms, extraordinary events in such an arid land. These tales may have been embellished, but they reflect the mythic tone of the entire expedition. Why did Alexander risk so much to reach the temple? The answer lies in his ambition, not just to rule the known world, but to become more than human, like the pharaohs before him. Alexander wanted divine legitimacy. He believed, or wanted others to believe, that he was not merely the son of Philip of Macedon, but the son of Zeus Ammon, the supreme god of both the Greek and Egyptian pantheons, whose earthly voice whispered from the Siwan temple. When he arrived at the oasis, Alexander was welcomed with great honor. The priests, likely well aware of his power and political reach, received him in the temple's inner sanctum. A rare privilege. What transpired in that meeting remains a mystery. No detailed account exists, but Alexander emerged transformed. Later, when asked what the oracle had told him, he was famously vague. Some sources suggest the oracle addressed him as the son of Zeus. Others say Alexander received a prophecy of victory and divine favor. Whatever the truth, Alexander's behavior changed. He increasingly portrayed himself as a semi-divine figure, commanding loyalty not just as a king, but as a god in human form. The desert had given him more than just an answer. It had given him myth, and myth, once claimed, could move armies, build cities, and reshape empires. The temple had spoken, and Alexander never looked back. All right, guys, if you're finding the story of Alexander and the oracle as fascinating as I am, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? More ancient mysteries are just around the corner. The Temple of the Oracle at Siwa stood at the crossroads of cultures, not just geographically, but spiritually. Its god, Amun, had long reigned as one of Egypt's most powerful deities, but as Greek influence spread into Egypt, Amun underwent a transformation in the minds of the Mediterranean world. He was reborn as Zeus Ammon, a fusion of two supreme gods, Egyptian and Greek, united in the blazing desert of Siwa. This fusion was more than symbolic. It reflected a broader syncretism, the blending of beliefs, images, and rituals that occurred when empires collided. For the Greeks, Zeus was the king of the gods, thunder-wielding, bearded, omnipotent. Amun, for the Egyptians, was the hidden one, unseen, mysterious, the breath behind all creation. He was often depicted with a ram's horns, symbols of virility, power, and divine presence. When Greeks encountered Amun, they recognized a familiar authority and gave him the name Zeus Amun. At Siwa, this blended identity took on extraordinary weight. The priests there were Egyptian, trained in ancient rites, yet their fame reached the Hellenistic world. For visiting Greeks like Alexander the Great, the oracle of Zeus Amun represented not only a divine voice, but a bridge between civilizations. If Alexander could be declared the son of Zeus Amun, he could rule both Greeks and Egyptians with a single divine lineage. The imagery followed him. Coins minted during his reign began to show Alexander adorned with ram's horns, a direct reference to Zeus Amun and his divine paternity. This wasn't a stylistic flourish, it was a political message. Alexander wasn't just endorsed by the gods, he was of the gods. This claim helped unify a vast empire where religion was as much a tool of rule as sword or law. Zeus Amun's cult spread beyond Siwa. Temples were built or rebranded in his name across North Africa, Greece, and even parts of Asia. Pilgrims continued to make the trek to Siwa, drawn by the mystique of a god who was both familiar and foreign. Both Greek and Egyptian, the temple had become more than a shrine. It was a cosmic junction where empires, gods, and destinies met. In the echo of its oracle, one could hear the voice not of a single culture, but of a world in transformation, and in that transformation, Zeus Amun reigned supreme. Unlike the towering pylons of Luxor or the sprawling avenues of Karnak, the temple of the oracle at Siwa was modest in scale, but monumental in meaning. Built into the limestone cliffs of the Agurmi Hill, the structure blended seamlessly into its desert surroundings, almost as if it had emerged from the rock itself. But this wasn't a flaw of grandeur, it was a choice. The temple's power came not from its size, but from its secrecy. Approaching the temple, pilgrims would pass through winding pathways and narrow gates, ascending toward a sanctuary carved into the hill. The complex included a forecourt, a small hall, and finally the Holy of Holies, the inner chamber where the oracle's voice was said to reside. This final space was off-limits to all but the high priest and select individuals. Like Alexander, its simplicity concealed its sanctity. There were no grand statues or golden shrines, only silence and the unseen presence of a god. The temple's design served a purpose, to disorient and humble. The tight corridors and sharp angles forced visitors to slow down, to lower their heads, to move with caution and reverence. In the desert, where vastness and exposure ruled, the temple offered enclosure and stillness. Light barely entered the sanctuary. Incense would have hung heavy in the air. Echoes turned whispers into something otherworldly. Scholars believe the temple may have had roof openings or vents to carry the priest's voice into adjoining rooms, heightening the drama of the oracle's declarations. From the shadows, a god would speak, and listeners would feel awe not because of what they saw, but what they heard. The architecture wasn't just functional, it was ritualistic theater. Surrounding the temple were other structures, priests' quarters, ritual pools, and sacred gardens fed by natural springs. Even in this arid land, Siwa was blessed with water, adding to the belief that the oasis itself was touched by divine hands. From this sacred hill, one could see the dunes stretching endlessly, a reminder of the temple's isolation and importance. This was not a place for crowds. It was a place for pilgrims, prophets, and kings, a space designed not to impress the eyes, but to stir the soul. And in that still, cloistered chamber, the future could be whispered from stone. As centuries passed and empires shifted, the temple of the oracle at Siwa began to fade. Not in legend, but in voice. The divine breath that once stirred the desert winds grew still. By the time the Roman Empire took root in Egypt, The oracle's prominence had begun to wane. What had once been a cosmic crossroads between gods and kings was now a relic of a fading world. There was no single moment when the oracle fell silent. It was a slow unraveling. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his generals fought bitterly over his empire, and the political unity that had given the temple prestige dissolved. Though Zeus Ammon continued to be venerated in name, the pilgrimage to Siwa no longer held the same magnetic pull. Power shifted back to the Nile Valley and to cities like Alexandria, where philosophy and science began to replace oracular faith. The rise of Rome brought new gods, new laws, and new priorities. Roman emperors paid lip service to Egyptian cults, but the centralized bureaucratic religion of the empire left little room for the shadowy ambiguity of oracles. Shrines like Siwa's were increasingly seen as quaint remnants of a mythic past, respected but no longer consulted for matters of state. Then came Christianity. As it spread across Egypt in the early centuries CE, it cast a harsh light on the old pagan ways. By the 4th century, under the Christianized Roman Empire, temples to the ancient gods were being shut down or repurposed. Oracles were denounced as demonic or deceitful. And in this sweeping religious upheaval, the voice of Ammon at Siwa, already a whisper, was extinguished. The temple itself fell into disrepair, its stones weathered by time and sandstorms. Priests vanished, rituals ended. The god who once spoke to Alexander and guided kings now stood mute, buried under the sands of history. Travelers still visited, curious about its legacy, but found only silence and ruins. And yet the story didn't vanish. Siwa became legend, a place spoken of in hushed tones by scholars and dreamers. The temple may have lost its oracle, but it had gained something else: mystery. In silence, the temple became immortal, not in prophecy, but in memory, not in sound, but in stone. For centuries, the temple of the oracle at Siwa lay hidden from the wider world, buried not under rubble, but under forgetfulness. The oasis remained inhabited, its people living in quiet continuity, but the once sacred temple was no longer a place of pilgrimage. Its walls weathered under relentless desert winds. Its legends, though still told among locals, had faded from global memory. That began to change in the 18th and 19th centuries, when European explorers and scholars, swept up in a wave of curiosity about ancient Egypt, turned their attention to the western desert. Siwa was difficult to reach, its isolation protected by harsh terrain and wary tribes. But in 1792, the first documented European, an Englishman named William George Brown, braved the journey. Others followed, drawn by rumors of a lost oracle visited by Alexander the Great. By the early 20th century, archaeologists and historians began surveying the ruins in earnest. The Agurmi Hill complex was identified as the likely site of the Temple of Amun. Though modest in size, the structure matched descriptions from ancient texts: a central chamber, thick defensive walls, and its vantage point over the surrounding oasis. The temple wasn't grand, but it was exactly where history said it would be. Excavations were limited and cautious. The site had suffered erosion, but some stonework and inscriptions remained. Fragmentary as it was, the architecture spoke volumes. A stone altar, traces of columns, rooms aligned with celestial bodies. Each clue confirmed that this windswept ruin had once held the ear of kings and gods. More than archaeology, it was the mythology of Siwa that drew fascination. The idea that Alexander had stood here, alone in a desert sanctuary, hearing words that would change empires, captured the imagination of generations. Poets, historians, and travelers romanticized the journey, blending fact and legend into a timeless narrative. Today, visitors still come to Siwa, not to consult an oracle, but to feel the echo of its silence. The temple, though worn, remains standing. Its stones are sun-bleached, its walls crumbling, but the air around it still hums with something ancient, something unresolved. Ruins don't need voices to speak. They speak through presence, through mystery. And in Siwa, the stones remember what the world once forgot. Though the temple no longer speaks with the voice of gods, the oasis of Siwa still breathes with life, culture, and memory. Far from being a forgotten outpost, Siwa remains a vibrant, living community, its people guardians of a heritage that stretches back millennia. The oracle may be silent, but the traditions it once inspired still ripple through the town's language, rituals, and rhythms. Siwans speak a distinct Berber dialect, known as Siwi, unique in Egypt and a testament to the oasis's ancient roots. Oral storytelling remains vital, just as it did in the days of the oracle. Elders pass down myths, family histories, and local legends, blending Islamic faith with pre-Islamic customs in subtle ways. Many Siwans still recount tales of Alexander's visit, not from books, but from memory. The architecture of Siwa also preserves echoes of the past. Traditional mud brick buildings, cool in the searing desert heat, line the town, and the ruined fortress of Shali, built from salt and clay, still towers over the oasis like a ghost of another age. The design of these structures reflects a continuity of form and function that has resisted change for centuries. Siwa's sacred geography remains powerful. Nearby springs and pools are still venerated. Cleopatra's Pool, a natural spring believed to have been used by the famous queen herself, remains a popular spot for both locals and visitors. Rituals tied to fertility, harvest, and healing still occur, many layered with Islamic prayers but rooted in older traditions. Even marriage festivals, like the annual celebration at Gebel Dakrur, preserve elements of Siwa's spiritual past. Families gather, songs echo, and matches are made. Not unlike the ancient gatherings once held at the temple, where people sought guidance not only for war and kingship, but for life itself. In the modern age, Siwa has become a quiet pilgrimage site of a different kind, not for prophecy but for peace. Travelers seeking escape from the noise of modernity come here to walk the palm groves, soak in the desert silence, and reflect on a time when God spoke from stone. Siwa reminds us that history is not only found in books or beneath the ground, it lives in people, in custom, in memory, and through them the oracle still murmurs. Not in thunder, but in whispers. The temple of the oracle at Siwa may no longer stand in its full glory, but its legacy endures, in myth, in memory, and in the minds of those who seek meaning beyond what is written. For centuries, its voice guided kings and comforted pilgrims. Its silence today only deepens its mystique. Few places in the ancient world held such a profound air of sacred uncertainty, a space where questions were heavier than answers, and silence could feel divine. Siwa's oracle lives on not in revived rituals, but in the stories we continue to tell. Alexander the Great's visit remains one of history's most compelling crossroads. A mortal man, surrounded by sand, seeking to confirm that he was more than human. Whether the oracle truly declared him a god or merely allowed him to believe it, the outcome was the same. Destiny was shaped. The enduring fascination with Siwa comes from this fusion of history and myth. It asks us timeless questions. Can men become gods? Can destiny be revealed? Does the voice of truth ever speak plainly or only in riddles? And perhaps most importantly, do we still listen for those whispers? Modern seekers visit the ruins not with questions of empire or conquest, but for clarity, for stillness, for presence. The desert remains vast and unmoved, the temple crumbling but magnetic. The same sun that scorched Alexander's caravan now warms curious travelers. The same silence that once surrounded the Holy of Holies still envelops the broken walls. Siwa invites reflection, not because it gives answers, but because it has always honored the asking. The oracle, like all ancient voices, was never about fortune-telling. It was about direction, affirmation, possibility. The journey across the sands was never just a physical trial. It was a ritual of transformation. You didn't just arrive at the temple, You became someone else along the way. Today, as we face our own deserts of meaning, identity, and purpose, perhaps the oracle still has something to offer. Not a booming voice from the past, but a quiet suggestion in the mind. Who are you really? And what are you becoming? The temple is dust. The voice is gone, but the question remains, and that, perhaps, was always the real oracle. What a journey through sand and time. What do you think truly happened when Alexander met the oracle? And what ancient mysteries still call to you? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the Siwa Oasis. If this story sparked your curiosity, please hit that like button. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications so you don't miss our next adventure into the enigmatic past. Until then, keep questioning and stay curious.